Hello, everybody. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and joining me today is my good friend, Dickson Despommier.
Hello there, Vincent.
Are you my good friend?
Yeah, you bet I am.
Known you for many years.
Many.
Dickson, you're a professor at Columbia University.
Emeritus professor.
Oh, that's okay. We're still a professor.
Okay.
You spent many years
Yeah.
studying parasites.
True.
And now you've published a book, which is why we're here today to talk about Dickson's new book, The New City,
Right.
How to Build Our Sustainable Urban Future.
Right.
Dickson Despommier. Why did you write this book, Dickson?
Well,
Why can you? Because you're a parasitologist.
exactly right. That's the whole reason. Because if you look at the way cities behave, they are parasitic on the landscape. In every aspect of whatever they need, they get it from some other place, not from the inner city, not from the outer city. They get it from the landscape. Water, energy, food, even building materials. It all comes from the outside. Cities don't produce anything except people.
Well, they
And
produce
culture.
Yes, culture. They produce ideas that go
course.
on to the rest of the world.
That is, most cities do that. I won't say that every city
So
does that. But
there used to be industry in cities, right?
there's still, if you go around the world, you will see that's not a thing of the past. That's still happening. And in fact, even agriculture, outdoor agriculture, is part of some cities in terms of the way they use their properties. But cities, I've always lived in a city, I've always worked in a city, and I'm now an octogenarian. So that sort of gives me, I guess, the privilege of having lived long enough to see changes even in the city that I called home, which is New York. Although I lived in New Jersey, I worked all my life in New York. And I've seen this city change from horrible to mediocre to wonderful in some areas, and I've seen it remain exactly the same in other areas. So I'm disappointed with the way cities have behaved. And they don't see themselves that way, but of course, most cities are devoted to commerce. And that's number one. All cities have a big commercial center. Even if it's not industrial, it's still to do business. And it's not designed for people, it's designed for business. And that's what's basically wrong with big cities, and that is it doesn't take into consideration the lives of the people that actually work there. And if you look at New York, for instance, how many people, in your estimation, do you think don't live in New York but work in New York?
I don't know the numbers, but New York is
big.
unique because many people live here.
Yeah.
Whereas many other cities, at least in the U.S., at 5 p.m. they close down and there's nothing.
That's true.
People leave.
No, you're right.
And there's
you're
not
right.
much of an entertainment or
Yeah,
restaurant.
I have to agree with
but
you
New
there.
York is quite different. I always notice that when I travel.
Yeah.
All these other
That's right.
cities, right?
Well, I don't think Boston or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., or, we can go down the list, but I think it deals with size, and it deals with their involvement with commerce. And then entertainment. New York City doesn't close down because it's an entertainment capital as well. So,
all right.
but it's not a perfect world. It's not a perfect world.
Let's start with the book.
Sure.
The very first sentence of the preface
Yeah.
is, it's time to reimagine the built environment.
It is.
So tell us, what is a built environment?
Okay, so the built environment is the one we create from scratch. We take limestone, we take iron ore, we take sand, and from those three raw materials we make steel, we make glass, and we make concrete.
That's the built environment.
And they use those three materials religiously, almost. There are building codes that say you must use those materials in most cities. And the environmental impact of just harvesting those materials and then rendering them useful creates a huge carbon footprint, an enormous carbon footprint, as a matter of fact, so high that cities, even though they only occupy 2% of the land mass of the world, generate 60% of the greenhouse gases, either by construction or by operation.
All right, you said many things I think we need to explain, because I
Sure.
don't think everyone knows the definitions.
That's
First,
fine.
carbon footprint.
Right. That is to say, if you have a structure, let's say the Empire State Building, and you know what it's made out of.
Which is not far from here.
It's not far from here. You can deconstruct that building into its materials and find out how much fossil fuel was used to dig it out of the ground, to supply the energy, to render iron ore into steel, to melt sand into glass. All those activities require lots of energy, and that's fossil fuels, and that's carbon.
Carbon, all right.
So that's a carbon footprint. They measure the material worth in terms of carbon.
All right, and then greenhouse gases. What's that?
Yeah, I think most people are familiar with it, but let's just go back to what is a greenhouse. And a greenhouse is a building that's got glass, and inside you've got plants usually, and the sunlight goes through the glass, and as it does so, it slows down. And as it stays inside the building, it can't get back out again. So the greenhouse in the wintertime, if you're growing food or exotic plants like orchids, it's an advantage. But in the summer, you have to worry about it overheating because the sunlight still shines through and it still slows down because the glass slows the wavelength down. Well, imagine now instead of a greenhouse, you've got the earth. And instead of glass, you've got the atmosphere. Now, as the sunlight goes down through the atmosphere, it encounters molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide and other molecules that slow down the wavelengths of these light rays that are coming from our sun. When they strike the earth, in most cases, if it's on a white surface, they just bounce right back up and go into outer space. But if it's a darker surface, they're absorbed. And the heat that represents the wavelength of light that comes through is absorbed by the planet. And that's happening more and more and more now because we're darkening our planet by losing our glaciers, our polar caps. Those are things that are called albedo. That's the technical term for that. And albedo determines how much sunlight that strikes the Earth actually stays on the Earth. But the other thing that happens with gases like methane, CH4, and carbon dioxide, CO2, they're much larger than O2. And as a result, when a sun ray hits, or photons, a stream of photons, hits a carbon dioxide molecule, it really slows down. It sometimes slows down when it hits oxygen, but not all the time. But always when it hits CO2 and methane, it slows down. And there are some other greenhouse gases that are not carbon related that also are important to think about. So that's a greenhouse effect.
So as we generate carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels and methane from animals, right?
Methane from animals and from, in this case, the melting of the tundra and the release of huge quantities of stored methane that occurred during the glaciation period a couple of 100,000 years ago. That's all now thawing out, and it's going up in the atmosphere. And so we've got methane to worry about as well.
All right. So now back to the statement. Why is it time to reimagine the built environment?
Okay, because climate change is real. If anybody doesn't believe that, it doesn't really matter if you believe it or not. It's based on science. So science, it's not a belief system. We keep saying that on our podcasts. And here is the evidence. And in this book, it's a very thin book, by the way. You know, there are not a lot of pages in my book. I didn't want to confuse.
Get tired of writing?
I didn't want to confuse the audience. I wanted only the essence of what I wanted to say to stay in this book. And the editors at Columbia University Press were a little apprehensive at first, but when they saw the final draft, they were very pleased. Because you can read this book in perhaps 3 nights. If you have other things to do, you can take some time and you can read it. But it only takes about 2 or 3 days to read the book. It's not a tome. It's not an academic exercise in explaining in excruciating detail what climate change really is. What this book does is say, look, climate change is real. Here's the evidence, and the evidence is supplied by government agencies like NASA and NOAA and the United States Geological Survey. Those three groups collect evidence as to the physicality of our planet. And they present them to the public, and the public can deal with those facts any way they want. They can accept them, they can reject them, they can use them in their own belief systems if they want to, but if they do it like most people, they see the facts and then apply them to the situation. And so the fact is that cities generate 60% of the greenhouse gases that are plaguing our planet at this moment, and it's getting worse. And it's getting worse. So yes, this is the time to reimagine the built environment in a way that eliminates that as a possibility. And that's what I did.
So that's what the book is about, essentially, reimagining how to make new cities.
That's right.
So as to take care of this greenhouse gas problem.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly, because actually this started out as a little project in a course that I teach now at Fordham called Ecology for Designers. For lack of a better title, I had to pick something.
It's a good title. I like it.
Well, it's a good title. The students are attracted to it. I have a standard number of 12 students every year, and I'm into my 7th year now for this course. And the course started out similar to the course that I taught at Columbia for vertical farming, in that I allowed the students to generate half of the content of the course by researching certain problems that I would give them. And they're very good at that, by the way. It's not that you're just giving your course away and walking away from it. I mean, I stayed there as a guider of where the information is and how you might interpret it. But even at an undergraduate level, if they're smart kids, they can figure it out very fast. And so I went around the room, and all 12 students gave a different answer as what they thought the cause of rapid climate change was. They all had a different answer. And I said, you're all correct. Everybody here gave a part of the reason why rapid climate change is the number one problem facing the Earth as we know it today. And that, not just us, all life forms on Earth are dealing with this as best they can. So I said, well, if you look back at the history of the way this civilization of ours developed, 10,000 years ago, if you had read the other book, the first sentence would have been 12,000 years ago, there wasn't a single farm on planet Earth. Not one farm. It's because we didn't know how to farm. But in the year 11,000 and then 10,000 years ago, something magical happened, like aliens came down and taught us how to do it or something, because farming arose in the Middle East, in China, in Mexico, all over the world. Everybody decided, you know what, I'm tired of hunting and gathering. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to grow my own food. And I won't have to move an inch if I don't want to. I can be a couch potato. In fact, I'll raise couch potatoes. So that started a snowball effect of change. And the change was not for the better, because in order to grow food, you need land. And in order to use the land for growing food, you have to disassociate it from whatever it was doing prior to that. And in most cases, where the land was fertile enough to allow a robust farming effort, it was loaded with trees. So one of the solutions to farming is to cut down the trees and make room for farms.
What do you do with the roots?
You pull them out. That's a great question, because I don't know how long we have for this, but the invention of dynamite solved that problem, right? And Alfred Nobel, for all of his genius, regretted it to his dying day, because what it allowed for was a farmer with a forest, and he wanted to clear it, or she, they would take a long time to pull out the roots, because they use their animals to pull out the roots. But after dynamite, you just stick a dynamite in there, light the fuse, run like hell, and the next thing you know, no more roots. And in 1 week, you could clear an entire forest.
So in your book, you go through a history of the city. So give us an overview, starting from this time when people decided they could farm.
Okay.
What happened?
All right. Well, the evidence is sketchy. Okay, so I can give you what I've read about this because obviously I'm not an expert on the anthropological aspects of urbanization. I'm relying on other people's knowledge, so it's secondhand knowledge, but it's still pretty reliable secondhand knowledge. So the first city ever on Earth was Jericho. Jericho's in the Middle East. And it was there because that's where wheat was invented as a crop to farm. And people liked wheat because they could not only use it for products like bread and flour to make other things with as well, but they could also store it and they could use it as money. They could actually barter with it and say, you see that brass instrument over there? How many grains of wheat do you think that brass instrument's worth? And they would put a value on it, like a handful, 2 handfuls a cup. They had, value systems that were, they didn't last very long, but that started the thinking process. And so the next thing you knew, there were lots of people that wanted to live near where the wheat was being grown, because that's where the money was coming from. The money in quotes now. And so Jericho became the first city. And the other thing that was interesting about Jericho was that it was near the Jordan River. And the Jordan River served as their irrigation system. And they invented irrigation. That's where it first started. And it didn't actually start. Jericho's about 12 or 11,000 years old. You date the wheat that's been domesticated, and it corresponds exactly with the age of Jericho. That's by carbon dating. Mm-hmm. So the idea about growing stuff and developing into what you would call large collections of people eventually started to sort itself out in terms of, well, I can raise the crops, or I can harvest the crops, or I can store the crops, or I can sell the crops, or I can market your product for, the next thing you know, you've got a differentiation of human activity, which if you trace back where all the guilds in Holland come from and where all the labor unions and all that other stuff, it comes from the fact that we became specialized. And we helped to jumpstart the modern civilizations that we know today. Not all of them survived. A lot of them didn't because of climate change. Even then, climate change affected where you could grow wheat, how much you could grow, and how often. So, for instance, the Egyptian cultures did very well, but the Middle Eastern cultures, apart from them, in the Mesopotamian Valley, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, didn't do very well because their flooding regimes were less reliable than they were in Egypt.
What are some of the other technologies that changed the face of the city? So we have agriculture, which started it. What else?
Sure. So once you've got a large number of people and food becomes essential for the maintenance of that city, because that's where it was founded next to where the food comes from, then you had to predict when the food would be ready, right? When should I plant? How long should I grow? When should I harvest? Those are all astronomical and mathematical constructs. So we had to invent a calendar, and we had to invent mathematics, and a lot of it was invented in the Middle East, by the way, to accommodate predictability as to when you should plant, when you should allow to grow, and when you should harvest. And so a number of activities grew up around those things, like, let's say, unorganized religions first. They had a god for this and a god for that and a god for that. And their religions sort of corresponded to their harvesting regimes, and they had celebrations for that. And when it failed, of course, they blamed each other. They didn't blame the weather. They didn't blame the climate. They said, God is angry. They have punished us, and we will sacrifice Jones. What are you doing tomorrow? And they would pick somebody, and they would make a scapegoat of that person. And the next year, maybe the crops would come in, and they said, see, I told you, it was his fault. Well, of course it wasn't, but they founded religions on that basis, mathematics. And then with leisure time, Oh, you get music, you get science, you get history, you get all of the cultural aspects of life as we know it today had its origins mostly, not all, but mostly, in cities, creating leisure time for people to explore their own creativity. And so cities became wonderful places for some things, but in other situations, it was just the worst place in the world to live because it was disease-ridden, it was filthy. Even I have a big section in here on the water issue in Rome and how they handle their garbage and how they handle their wastewater. They didn't handle it. They just thought they did, but they weren't. They would throw their waste out the window every night and depend on, I guess, ad hoc diners like rats and cats and dogs. Yeah. Clean it up, that's fine, right?
You have always said the greatest invention of humanity is...
Oh, yeah, sure. The invention of the outhouse. The invention of the outhouse and sanitation revolutionized, but that was jump-started by cholera outbreaks and proving what caused them and then interfering with that by sanitation. So that's well documented in my book.
So what do we talked a little bit about climate change? What do cities have to do with them? You said you gave us a number about making a lot of carbon, right?
Sure.
Where does that come from?
So it comes from two places. One is it comes from the materials that are necessary to build the city with, first of all. And if you look around at most modern cities, let's take New York as a great example. It's most of the downtown area of New York City, and we're sitting in the epicenter of it right now as we speak. Those are concrete and glass and steel. And those three materials from the earth to that product takes an enormous amount of energy. And that energy is all supplied by fossil fuels. Now, once you've got your building, let's just thrill our audience with our typical TWIV openings. So what's the weather like out there, Vincent?
Today it's
what is it like out there
quite
today?
Warm today.
Pretty warm, right? How warm? Too warm, right?
For me, it's fine.
Well, I could probably stand it too, but there are some people out there that would actually pass out from that heat. And that's at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was already in the high 80s. By the afternoon, it'll be in the high 90s. It might even exceed 100 degrees. What's the temperature in here?
Yeah, it's probably 74.
How did that happen?
I guess we used carbon.
Oh, I see.
And we generated CO2. So let's see. So the air conditioning is run by electricity.
Of course.
And the electricity is generated actually here in the city at the Con Ed plant, right?
That's right.
This one, which, how does it generate? By gas? Burning gas?
Yes, it's a multi-fueled power plant that can take coal, it can take oil, it can take natural gas.
Okay, burning all of that to generate the steam to make the electricity.
In the old days, they would burn
that
coal.
generates carbon dioxide, and that's part
Correct.
of the problem.
That's exactly right. And that footprint is getting higher and higher, larger and larger. And it's not getting smaller. Cities are getting larger. They're developing into megacities. And megacities have special problems.
So that's a good question. I look around New York, and skyscrapers, residential skyscrapers, are going up in Newark, in Jersey City.
Yes, they are.
They're full of people who need electricity.
That's correct.
Does anyone ever make a calculation and say, can we sustain this or not? Or you just put them up to make money?
Well, that's interesting because that's very interesting. I think, they have all done the calculations, but they're not telling you all the story behind the calculations. In New Jersey, where I live also, and I know you live there as well, the state of New Jersey now is subsidizing individual homes to install solar panels. Why are they doing that?
To use less electricity. Right?
Not just less electricity. New Jersey's population is growing. They don't have the facilities to supply that growing population with enough electricity, unless, of course, you stop using it. Now, if you stop using it because now you're going to use solar power, oh, okay, then I can use the energy I used to put into your house to the growth of these new places. Otherwise, you can't grow. And that's the worst thing you could tell a politician, is that they can't grow the economy, right? And when you grow the economy, of course, it's associated with a carbon footprint. And even to make solar panels has a carbon footprint, but it's not as large as using up fossil fuels virtually every day to keep ahead of the weather, to keep ahead of the climate changes. So it's an enormous problem that has not been solved. And in fact, it's getting worse. And you can see what's happening when countries like Russia and China and the United States and Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, all those countries where they've got a lot of oil, the price of oil fluctuates with the political weather, right? That's a different kind of climate change. And what you've got here is a scramble almost every day for the cheapest and most abundant source of all of these fossil fuels that will eventually will run out of. So you're just prolonging the inevitable by saying, we're here, we've got enough oil. Yeah, well, that's right. But the people over there don't, because that's where you took it from to bring it over here. It's not a zero-sum explanation at this point. So we need another approach.
So your book has some solutions in the form of what you call pillars of sustainability.
Right.
So let's go through them. There are 4.
Yep.
And briefly, because we want people to still read the book.
Sure.
We're not going to explain it all here. Pillar 1, carbon storage.
Right. So
what is that?
Can we back up just one moment?
We
because
could, sure.
Each of those pillars, taken together, all 4 of those pillars, are the same functionals that you would find in a hardwood temperate zone forest. So we're now comparing a city with a temperate zone forest, and that's called biomimicry. So biomimicry is at the heart of these changes, because Howard Odum, not Eugene Odum. Eugene Odum was his brother who taught ecology at the University of Georgia. Howard Odum taught at Florida State University and Florida University. He taught at both of those places. Howard had a great saying, and the saying was, nature has all the answers. What's your question? So my question is, how can I get a city to behave as economically and as balanced as a temperate zone hardwood forest? How can I do that? Because let's talk about what trees do first. I know this is a diversion, but it's a good diversion, right? So trees, what are they known for? This is temperate zone trees, not tropical trees. First of all, they're made out of carbon. Cellulose and lignin are the 2 compounds. These are hydrocarbons. The cellulose is a sugar, basically, that's been linked together in a way which is not accessible to most animals, except termites, of course, and certain other animals can access the wood inside of a tree as food because it's solid sugar. But it's linked up in such a way that it's dense, and it's not even part of the living tree. The living part of the tree is at the edge, just below the bark. And that's like a coral reef that makes itself bigger and bigger and bigger. The part below where the coral reef organisms are is all inert material. It's calcium carbonate, basically. So that's the ocean's look-alike for a tree that makes itself bigger by adding carbon to the trunk as it photosynthesizes, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And inside that tree is more and more and more carbon. So a tree sequesters carbon. Trees are called carbon sinks. And a carbon sink is a place where the carbon molecule, the carbon atom, can find a home without being recycled into the atmosphere at a rapid rate. This is a slow release. When a tree dies, then the carbon is released. So trees do one thing that I want my city to do, and that is to sequester carbon, because that's a big problem right now. Number 2, trees through photosynthesis generate food. And that food is in multiple forms. I mean, I don't know If you're a big fan of pancakes, I like pancakes, but not all the time. But I like good maple syrup on my pancakes. I demand absolute, genuine maple syrup. And what is maple syrup? It's sugar. It's flavored sugar produced by maple trees. But what really is it? It's their equivalent to storage of energy in the form of a usable molecule. And in this case, it's called glucose. And it stores it in the root systems. And then in the springtime, it brings it back up to refurbish the tree and to get a jump start on the next year's growth. So trees supply food for lots of other animals also, and even some plants as well. So nuts and fruits and berries and all those things, those are all products of a tree's metabolism, which doesn't benefit the tree much, but it benefits the animals that eat those items and keep them alive. It keeps the diversity of the ecosystem intact. Number 3. It harvests rainwater. It does so with a little help. All of its root systems are connected in a hardwood forest by a fungus called mycorrhiza. It's a fungus which actually digs into the roots of the trees and allows water to transport from this tree to this tree. And that was only a recent discovery, by the way. That's only about 10 or 15 years old. So it's a remarkable revelation to see an entire forest that collaborates and cooperates altruistically to keep the same resources at the same levels in all the trees, whether they're on the top of the hill or at the bottom of the hill where the water tends to accumulate. The mycorrhiza allow that to happen. Why do you think that is? Because fungi can't make their own food. So what do they use for food? They use the products that the trees produce. So in return for supplying water and a connectivity to all the trees, they're rewarded by getting their food from the trees. So it's a mutualistic society, that a hardwood forest. I want a city to behave like that. Okay, so those are the 4 pillars, all right? So the last, well, what did I forget?
Yeah, well, the first pillar is
Carbon
storage,
sequestration.
right? The second is urban agriculture.
Oh, okay, so
according to your book. The third is harvesting water, which
right,
you've mentioned.
and then renewable energy.
Renewable energy.
That's right.
Right. So carbon storage, planting trees, and another aspect in your book is making buildings in cities out of wood.
Correct. Sounds heretical, right?
Well, I don't know if it's heretical, but could
Well,
you do it? Is it physically possible?
Of course you can do
And
it.
could you
because
make a 100-story building out of wood?
the Japanese have already got a plan for a 70-story building, so I think the answer is yes.
Okay.
You can not only do it, they're going to do it, because the people who build things don't design things. That's done by the architects. And where do they go to school? They go to architecture school, right? And these are usually young people with bright eyes and bushy tails. They're all set to go out and conquer the world. They're going to redesign everything. If you can't go to one school now within the United States that doesn't teach about this kind of wood that I'm going to tell you about. The wood is a special wood. It's not the kind that allowed San Francisco to burn down in 1906. It's not the kind of wood that allowed Chicago to burn down or New York City to burn down. That's
because
the old wood.
cities used to be made of wood, right?
That's right. So the moment they said, you're going to build a building out of wood and replace all these buildings with that, you're crazy. You've got to be crazy. They said, wait. The best way I can illustrate this is to say, imagine a forest fire. Remember, we're basing this on hardwood forests. Right? So imagine a forest fire. Forest fire goes through the forest. It burns off all the branches. It burns off all the leaves. But after it finishes, what have you got? You've got the trunks of the trees that are still there. Why didn't they go? What's wrong? How come those tree trunks didn't get burned down with all the rest of the organic matter that was in the forest? And there's a good answer. The answer is density. Okay. Oxygen can't penetrate into the hardest, densest part of this tree trunk, right? So some guy in, not just some guy, I'm blocking on his name, it's in the book, studying at Graz University in Austria back in 1997, observed just that phenomenon, and said, why can't I design a wood product based on trees which imitates the density of a tree trunk? And if I could do that, I bet you I could build any kind of building out of it, and it's not going to burn down, it's going to char. And that's where cross-laminated timber came from. And that invention made this guy very rich. The European building industries all checked it out by doing their own fire tests. And it outperforms even the steel and concrete buildings that have flammable materials on the inside of them. This says all of the building will be made out of cross-laminated timber, including the walls, the ceilings, the floors, everything. Is it easy to build with it? And the answer is it's incredibly simple. You harvest trees of 9-inch diameter, mostly.
Which are grown on farms for this purpose.
No, not
right?
necessarily.
No?
Not necessarily. We'll come to that too. Some people would say, yeah, we should farm these trees. Well, there's a reason why we probably don't want to do that. But we don't have to do that, okay? Because it's already being done. In other words, anything that I'm talking about right now that I've written about is ongoing. These are not speculative things like I wish we could go to Jupiter or I wish that I could fly or stuff like this. It's not fanciful. It's based in reality because it's already happening. In fact, you'll notice the cover of the book. It's got some wooden artistic impressions of what a city should look like. This was done by a New York artist. And he picks up scraps of wood and designs buildings out of them.
So why is it good to make a city out of wood?
Okay, that's the best question now. Why would you want to do that? For the same reason that we would wish we had all of our trees back, where we used to have 6 trillion trees before farming. We now have 3 trillion trees. And we know that we have 3 trillion trees because we counted them. We actually counted the number of trees on the planet. We did that by teaching satellites how to count trees from the ground, saying this patch of forest has so many trees in it. How many more patches like this are there? The next thing you know, you've got a number. It's about 3 trillion trees. But that means that half of the Earth's ability to sequester carbon in trees is gone. Substituted for that, farming. Oh, that's a big problem, right? But we have a solution for the farm. We can farm in buildings. We can farm off the soil. We can take those farms and allow them to revert back to what they used to be, which is a forest. Most of the hardwood forests of the United States, for instance, are found in the corn belts. So,
Right, so it's all about letting trees grow back.
It is. And then
then
selectively logging out the trees that are useful for making cross-laminated timber, which doesn't include the old trees. It only includes the young 20-year-old trees.
So what fraction of a city should be wood?
All of it.
All of it?
Every bit of it.
So New York is full of brand new skyscrapers,
Yeah,
and they're
that's
not
right.
going to go away anytime
Exactly. No,
soon,
well,
right?
Let's talk about that because this is a revelation for me because I didn't really know the answer to this until I started to inquire. If you go back to the year 1900 and you looked at New York City, there weren't 8 million people living here. There were, I think, maybe 3 million people, or even less than that, in the total 300 square mile area of New York City. But the point is that it had a lot of buildings. If you go now to the year 2023 and try to find those buildings that were there in 1900, you can only find about 20% of those buildings. The rest are gone. They were replaced by these, as you say, new skyscraper-type buildings, steel, glass, and
But they're likely going to last longer than the ones that were built.
but they don't have to. The point is that if you look at cities the way they redesign themselves constantly, they're constantly redesigning themselves. The moment a new technology comes in that allows for, let's talk about using window glass that's coated with a special coating. When it dries, it's clear. Then it traps sunlight that goes through, It lets the visible light go through, but it traps the UV and the ultraviolet light. And those two wavelengths are high energy. Well, not so much for the UV, the infrared, but the UV definitely. And they will knock loose electrons from this material that they have painted on. They will then be shunted to the edge of the window, collected by an electrode, and put onto the building's grid. It's called clear photovoltaics. Imagine how much glass there is in New York City. What if you were to replace all that glass with clear photovoltaic glass, which is not unheard of? I mean, the people that are making the glass, of course, they're pushing very hard for this. You don't even have to shake the glass out. All you have to do is paint this stuff, let it dry, and put it on a wire electrode around it, and you've got a clear photovoltaic. So,
so that's a good argument for carbon.
Yeah.
Now you're recovering the farmland to make these trees.
Yep.
So how are we going to make our food? That's our second sustainability.
Well, every building in the new city will have some food manufacturing capacity. Every building, every single building. If it's a school, if it's a office building, of course, apartment houses will definitely. But that's a seemingly interesting trend that's going on now because of the pandemic that we just suffered through. It's not over, I agree. But the majority of people now are back on thinking that it is gone. They have started to work at home. And working at home means those office buildings that you now see all over the place, they're half empty. What are you going to do with those half-empty buildings? And so there have been some recent articles and some recent initiatives to put vertical farming inside those buildings and to take up that space with food growing capacity. And in fact, if things get worse, we'll have to do that. That's the point. I mean, if we don't change anything else except how do we get our food, then we'll have to grow it all indoors, because after a while we will not be able to farm any longer. The temperature will be too high.
And you have written a book about this. It's one of your other books.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Indoor farming or vertical farming?
Vertical farming, that's right. And it's caught on. It's now a $30 billion industry.
And I just showed you my hat of Gotham Greens when we visited that indoor
absolutely.
farm.
They're doing well, by the way.
So what can't you grow indoors so far?
Nothing.
Well, an apple tree?
If you want to, but
I use that because it's your name, you know.
Well, thank you. Well, I wouldn't want the trees to be inside because I want them outside collecting carbon from the atmosphere. They're going to sequester carbon, so that's fine. Leave the trees outdoors. But anything else, if you name it, we have a wonderful place to go for relaxation and rest, namely the Bronx Botanical Garden. And if you go inside the conservatory building and you look at the plant life in there, they've got zones around the world, deserts, high alpine, swamps, that sort of thing. And they've got all the plants that are common to those places growing inside a building in which they will replicate the environment necessary to grow those plants. The best example I saw, I don't know if you got to it or not, in Singapore, is the rain cloud forest. It's an amazing place that has 5 stories worth of a waterfall, and you spiral down on the staircase to see all the plants, and they're all growing in the core of the building. And the humidity is incredible. It's about 70%, but the temperature is in the low 70s. If you go outside, the humidity is in the 90%, and so is the temperature. So this is a building that actually has I think there are 55 different species of pitcher plants. They all come from Borneo, and they're all inside this one little building. So if you're going to ask me a question of what you can grow indoors, what do you want? That's Howard Odom's answer. You can grow anything indoors. What plants would you like to grow?
Well, you know, when you grow wheat, you grow hundreds of acres at a time. Where are you going to get that kind of space indoors?
Vincent, what is the most... I wish I had answers for Vincent because we're good friends. They may not all be right, by the way. What do you think the most prestigious journal in the United States is?
You mean like a scientific journal? A U.S.-based journal?
The one everyone would like to be into. but not everybody can be in that journal. But you know the journal I'm talking
The
about.
proceedings? Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences?
Correct. So 2 years ago, some friends of mine and I published an article on how to grow wheat indoors. And it was published in PNAS. And at that point, it was a hypothetical article to say, if the climate continues to change, and if all the crops continue to show adverse effects as the result of the climate change, then you'll even have to grow corn and wheat and millet and quinoa and everything else. Everything will have to be grown indoors. So if you don't know how to do that, you're basically screwed. So why not practice with a crop that you're familiar with, that you know you can grow indoors because NASA has already done that, and they have a lot of studies on that already. And so there's a guy in England that's actually going to take a big giant building in northern England and grow wheat in the building based on the article that we published.
All right.
So we're really happy with that.
All right, let's move on to another pillar, number 3, harvesting water from the air.
I love that topic. That's the best topic. That for me, that's because without water, you're dead.
Okay.
So
Right now we get it from...
this is a good example of using your body to illustrate the built environment. So these are 5 reservoirs in New York State. They're all connected by a single tunnel. And the tunnel brings the water all the way down to New York, New York.
Okay.
Okay.
Reservoirs.
That's what we've got now.
They're full of rainwater, right? And
And
runoff?
They're full of rainwater.
And runoff too from... Is it runoff as well?
Yeah,
But that's rain
rain-
ultimately.
That's rainwater. That's right. And the aquifer that surrounds these reservoirs is pristine. That is, the forest is intact. There are no farms. There are no built environment. So the water that falls is filtered first, and then it gets into the reservoir.
Okay.
So then that's what you're drinking, and it's essentially unfiltered water. So that's how New York City gets its water now. But that can't go on forever. And what if the water cycle changes, which it's likely to do as the result of rapid climate change? And that's true for every city. They're going to have to scramble and find other ways of acquiring water for their citizens, or they're just going to lose their citizens. And some cities actually closed down as a result of that. Jericho, still a city. The first city is still standing. But lots of other ancient cities disappeared when the climate changed over a 300 or 400 year period to eliminate a constant source of water in a river, which then dried up or changed its course to leave the area. Okay.
So what's the alternative to a reservoir? What is it?
Okay, well, it is rain. So the best example of that is Bermuda. So Bermuda is a little island in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of North Carolina, and it's owned by the British. It's a British protectorate, and it's got 63,000 people living on that little atoll of coral. And they don't harvest any water from the ground or from the ocean. It's all rainwater. So 63,000 people have already agreed to live their whole lives collecting rainwater from specially designed roofs that looks from the top almost like a spiral, and from the side it is, and it keeps taking the water down and down, and finally it empties it into a cistern. It's filtered, and that's what they use for their dishes, for their washing their hair, drinking, bathing, watering lawns, everything. We
could do that in a city, right?
Damn right. So do we do that in a city?
No, we don't have roofs, right?
No, we don't. But it's not difficult to retrofit a building to collect rainwater. It's not difficult. It's straightforward. And it requires very little in the way of fancy equipment. It requires a tube that's situated along the side of the building. And then there's a waterproof device which is deployed during the rainstorm, which almost like an upside down umbrella. They have these already. I'm not making this up. Those are in existence. And the water collects inside the upside down umbrella, and it's funneled down into this tube, which is waterproof, of course, and it just fills up. Now imagine city skyscrapers with 4 of these with a retrofitted rooftop, which collects raw water every time it rains. So let's talk about how much water we're talking about here. Right?
You must have done the calculation. Can we do this?
I didn't have to because the United States Geological Survey did it for me.
Mm-hmm.
New York City gets 47 inches of rain a year. Now, how much is that? Well, it depends on how large New York City is, right? So New York City is 300 square miles. That's its footprint. So how much rain in gallons is 47 inches of rain per year for 300 square miles?
I don't know. You're going to tell me.
It's huge. It's virus numbers. It's 250 billion gallons of water.
Is that enough for everyone?
Well,
or not? That must
no, let's talk about New York City's water budget also. So these 5 reservoirs supply all of the water for New York City, all of it. And so New York City consumes on a daily basis 1.2 billion gallons of water.
Mm-hmm.
So if you multiply 365 days times 1.2 billion, you'll exceed an annual rainfall collection. But
by how much?
Well, it's a lot, actually.
What was the
it's almost
annual
double.
Double? Okay.
Yeah. So they're depending on these reservoirs constantly being filled in order to continue to supply 1.2 billion. But we've had water shortages, and we've had to cut back, and we've had to conserve. And there are cities now which say, we don't want to keep doing this ad hoc and irregularly. We want to make it a policy that from now on, every new building that's constructed has to harvest its own water. And you take a city like Mexico City, it's got a much larger footprint. It's got like 42 inches of rain a year or something like this. It's over 500 billion gallons of water, and they don't collect one single drop. Why not? Okay, so that's one source of water that we are totally neglectful of, and we're about to change that. But in my city, every building will be able to collect water. Every single building. And underneath the city, there will be a series of connecting viaducts that allows each building to share its excess water with buildings that don't have enough. And so that's the concept of the forest and the way the mycorrhiza allow the water to be redistributed throughout the...
Right.
That's the biomimic.
What about wastewater? Can we make it clean?
There is the other source of water that we are so irresponsible with that it doesn't even, people don't believe you when you talk about it like that. But if New York City consumes 1.2 billion gallons a day, how much do you think they discard per day? Well, 1.2 billion. That's a pretty good guess. Most of that water comes in and it goes back out again. It's treated and then it ends up in the Hudson estuary. And we regard that as something to be avoided. Okay, but it's the most underutilized resource in the world. So there are some cities, and in Orange County, California, most of the cities in Orange County now recycle all of their wastewater. But if you were to tell somebody, oh, you see that glass of water over there that you just took a sip out of? Guess where that came from? And the common euphemism is from toilet to tap. And the next thing I won't drink this anymore. So they had to deal with that problem because
Sure, it is a problem, yeah.
You know what they did? They pumped it in the San Bernardino Hills north of the cities, and they withdrew it from the ground. They say, your water doesn't come from that building over there. Yes, it does. It comes from the ground. They had to socially market this in a way which allowed people to accept the fact that you're recycling all your wastewater. But better yet, San Francisco passed a law about 3 years ago that said every new skyscraper building in San Francisco must not only harvest rainwater, they also have to recirculate all of their wastewater and remediate it. So they use the same equipment that Orange County used because Orange County got a grant from the Gates Foundation. The Salesforce building got a grant from the Gates Foundation to invent a small unit that will take care of an entire building. And now they're the only building in San Francisco that recycles all of its water. And it's all drinkable. And they can use it to water their plants or to whatever else they use water for in that building.
All right, so what about the ocean? There's a lot of water out there. Is that too much
There's
energy?
a ton of it. Yeah, well, that's the problem. Reverse osmosis, distillation.
Generates a lot of carbon, I guess, right?
Lots of it, because it requires energy in order to boil the water.
So we're not ready for that yet.
We're not ready for that
Okay.
yet.
All right, so the last part is renewable energy.
Yep,
And we're back to solar.
we are.
Now, I read somewhere that we can make all the solar power we want,
Yes.
but we can't store it very well, and that's part of the problem.
It is a problem. We've got a big problem with regards to storage of energy. If you're looking at electricity as the product to be
Right.
stored. But what if that wasn't the product to be stored? What if there was something else that would then, when used, generate electricity on demand? Okay, so ultimately, well, let's talk about the passive renewable energies first. There's solar, then there's regular solar, and then there's transparent window solar.
Right.
Then the next one is wind. The next one is geothermal. And geothermal had a breakthrough about, I won't say how many years ago, but it's in the book. It's about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Somebody figured out that if you took cold water and injected it into a hole that went down until the temperature exceeded 90 degrees, the water would distribute and it would become superheated. Then, if it had another pipe somewhere near the pipe that put the cold water in to withdraw the superheated water, the superheated water could then be used to drive a turbine to make electricity. And then when it used up the energy from the hot water, they'd pump it back down into the ground. It would become superheated. They would withdraw it from the ground. They would use it. And it's a continuous cycle. They don't even have to use more water than when they started. They use this much water, and it gets superheated. They use it. They cool it. They put it back down again. They use it. They cool it. It's fabulous. But that's not what I'm in favor of. Although it's a good thing. It's a very good thing. And it's a recyclable thing, and you don't use up anything. But you have to be near a geothermal source that allows that to happen, right? So New Zealand or Italy or Iceland or some other place with a lot of geothermal energy would be ideal for that. Not out of the question. But the one that I most favor is a hydrogen fuel cell. So hydrogen fuel cells are interesting because as we speak in Germany, all of the state-run and the federal-run railroads, all of their engines run on hydrogen fuel cells, every one of them. So they have an industry now where they said hydrogen fuel cells are the energy of the future. BMW actually says this as well. I know you were fond of a car that you used to. Do you still have that car?
No, no.
So BMW has committed itself to producing cars in the future, not too distant future, that will be hydrogen fuel cell cars. So there are two problems with that. One is where you get your hydrogen from. So currently, a lot of the places are getting it from the smokestacks of Chinese coal power plants, because a lot of hydrogen is produced also when you burn coal. And you can harvest that hydrogen by a selective catalyst. And then you can use that hydrogen to combine with oxygen. And when you do that, you generate a lot of heat. And when you generate the heat, that's the heat that boils the water, that makes the steam, that makes the turbine turn around. Then, by electrolysis, it's a process where you use electricity to actually break apart the water molecule into oxygen and hydrogen. Now you've got the water product from the hydrogen fuel cell, and you can redistribute those atoms to have your hydrogen back. The oxygen goes back in the air, but there's plenty of that around, so that you can combine the hydrogen again and get a lot of energy. Now, you say, well, what is your storage unit? You ready for this? Ammonia.
Why is it ammonia?
Because that's NH4. When you take one hydrogen away from it, you have NH3. What do you call that? fertilizer.
Right.
So somebody has conceived of a scheme for that's what you store your hydrogen in. And it's non-flammable. It's noxious, but it's non-flammable. So it's a liquid. It's easily handled. If it spills, not too much gets hurt, right? It's not like gasoline or oil or things like that. And so you've got a big tank full of ammonia. And every time you need some hydrogen, you just tap off some, and you ship the NH3 to a fertilizer factory, and they make ammonium nitrate out of it.
And the fertilizer can be used in your vertical farms.
Correct.
So you don't have to put it in the dirt, and it doesn't run off into the ocean.
Exactly.
All right.
So if you're looking for balance, there are plenty of options. So I think the biggest question is, how come we're not doing any of this right now?
Yeah, so that's one of my final questions. When is this going to happen, and when will we know it?
Well, all right. Well, you're going to know it if you read my book, because the reason why I wrote this book was because it's already happening. All of these things that I've just talked about, these are not fictitious pie-in-the-sky, dreamer type of ideas. These are ongoing projects, including the clear photovoltaic solar panels. That's all commercially available. Every bit of what you've just heard is commercially available. And in fact, the CLT industry, which is the carbon sequestration part of this, is growing at such a rapid rate that they now have CLT manufacturing facilities throughout the entire Northwest United States, throughout the northwestern part of Canada, which is where you have these beautiful straight Douglas fir trees that you can then convert into straight cross-laminated timber. There's a wonderful talk by a guy by the name of Michael Green. He's an architect, and he's a big fan of cross-laminated timber, and he gives a TED Talk. And anybody that's interested, just type out Michael Green TED Talk, and you'll be quite amazed at, in 18 minutes, this guy will convince you, no matter what, that cross-laminated timber is the new concrete of cities.
Are there any wooden buildings in New York?
There are a few, but if you page through the book,
There's some photographs, yeah.
these are not good representations of the figures because it's all in color, but you can see building after building after building. All these buildings are made out of cross-laminated timber. And you'll say, well, cross-laminated timber, it's still made out of wood. It's going to burn. It'll char, but it won't burn. So they're making student dormitories out of it for colleges. There's a wonderful building at the university, at Michigan State University, called the STEM building, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. And that whole building is a living entity as to what's possible. So when students go to school there, they're surrounded by, wow, this is a beautiful building. How did this happen? All you have to do is ask that question, and the next thing you know, you're a big fan. So when in the beginning, when I started to look at this, and this was some time ago, maybe 8 years ago, 9 years ago, I didn't exactly know which direction this was going to go in. But there's no doubt about the fact that if a city were to convert to all wood buildings over 100 to 150 years, which is what it would take if you could just gradually reproduce. You knock down an old building, every time a building goes up, it's made out of cross-laminated timber. That's a little much to ask, but I think as this movement gains momentum, and as people see the logic to it, and the incentives are correct from city planners and buildings and mayor's offices, once they get on board for carbon sequestration and get credit for it and get money for it, they get paid to do this, then they're going to do it. Okay. So that's where we sit today. We have a number of buildings that are made out of wood, but none of them grow food, none of them capture energy, and none of them
capture water either, right?
That's right, capture the water. So you need one representative building in which all of these features are incorporated. And that's I'm going to tell you it's on the horizon. It may exist, but I don't know where it is. Every time I look on the internet and I look for examples of cross-laminated timber buildings, it's like watching, it goes viral. It's going viral. That's the best way to put it.
Who should read this book?
I wrote it for a general audience, and I tried not to use jargon to the point of going over the head of most educated readers. But I think this would be perfect for courses in high school and college for environmental sciences, for instance, and for pre-architecture schools, and for city planners. I think every city planner should have a copy of it. I think every mayor should have a copy of it. Every governor should have a copy. You know, when you do that, even if you get a book on their table, they'd probably just discard it for the most part, because when you deny something that's so obvious as climate change, you're doing it for a reason. Mm. And the main reason is commerce. That's the only reason to deny climate change, because if you do, then you can continue to abuse the environment. And you can say, well, it doesn't matter. But if you think it matters, then in good conscience, you could never do that. So I think once everybody finally realizes that when your grandmother dies from heat stroke, when your gardens won't grow anymore because the temperature is too high, when it doesn't rain any longer, or when it rains too much, those sorts of things, when all these things are coming together in ways which, if you don't know what you're looking at now, then you've kept your eyes closed for that whole time. I think this is an eye-opener for people who have never heard of this before. And that's, I would say, high school and college students mostly, but I think an educated public in general.
All right, that's the book, The New City by Dickson Despommier. Go out and buy it. Thank you, Dickson.
You're welcome, Vincent.